Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Superintendent Hoffmeister, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. I'm Brooke Meiller, Executive Director of School Support. We're so glad you've joined us for this webinar on federal flexibility and the CARES Act. We have partnered with the Comprehensive Center Network to provide this training. So I will now turn this presentation over to Felicia Reed from the Comprehensive Center Network.
Thank you so much, Brooke, and good afternoon, everyone. We from the Region 13 Comprehensive Center are pleased to be with you today and to present a little bit of information that we're hoping will help you move forward in your planning for your COVID-19 response, as I'm sure you're mired in it in everyday conversations, but we're hoping that this is an opportunity to think beyond your current state. A little bit of background about the comprehensive centers. They're federally funded technical assistance centers for state education agencies, and we partner with state agencies in Region 13 with the Bureau of Indian Education, New Mexico, and Oklahoma to provide technical assistance on a myriad of topics, but lately we've been focusing a lot on the CARES Act, on COVID-19, and specifically this team focuses on financial resource allocation for our states and in turn the districts and schools. Today we are focusing our attention on, oops, too many clicks. Understanding how federal funds, both those from the CARES Act and federal funds in general, can be used to support equitable and a comprehensive response to the COVID-19 emergency. So that's our goal of the day. We'll take you through a number of sections. One is about a framework for how to consider this work moving forward beyond the immediate urgent stage. Then we'll think about guiding principles for determining what to spend your money on, what one-time investments look like from the CARES Act, and flexibilities for ongoing investments as you move forward into the next school year. Finally, we will present to you a tool that we've helped the Oklahoma State Department of Ed to develop, and that will be in your hands very soon. So we'll preview that tool for you. And at the end, we'll be doing some Q&A, and we'll open that up so that anyone that has questions, we can start to answer them, and we can collect those for follow-up too, if that's necessary. Throughout the presentation, just a few housekeeping pieces. Throughout the presentation, we will be taking questions via the chat. So if you have any clarifying questions, please throw them in the chat, and we'll try to determine, we'll monitor that to try to determine whether we should answer them right then or keep them till the end. So feel free to chime in at any point. And we will ask you also to keep your microphones muted throughout, just to eliminate some of that background noise. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jason Willis, who's going to take us through a framework for considering the work ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Felicia. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you are doing well on this Tuesday. And we're really excited to have a chance to talk to you today a bit about how to think about the use of federal funds in response to this extraordinary experience that we're all going through at this point. And so before I kind of progress a little bit any further, I did just want to, also compliment Brooke's introduction, just really thank her and Robin for the opportunity to partner with them in the Oklahoma State Department of Education in exploring ways to support the better and more effective use of resources in your context. And I'm joined today, as you heard, from Felicia Brown-Reed. She's joining us along with Corey Donahue, as it is. And my name is Jason Willis. I'm a director here with West Ed. Our team does a significant amount of work around the kind of financing and systems improvement of public education at West Ed. And once again, just really happy to be here today and really looking forward to, providing you with some content that we hope will be helpful in your weeks and months ahead in this, really trying time. And look forward to answering your questions and getting a chance to engage with you too. So as Felicia said, please feel free to drop in your comments or questions in the chat. So we're going to trade off. So Felicia, Corey, and I are going to do some presentation throughout the next 45 minutes or so. So if you've got questions, those that are not presenting, we'll do our best to answer questions in chat. Otherwise, we'll open it up for the Q&A at the very end. So where we want to start is really this basic question of where do you even begin? As district administrators, this can be an extraordinarily overwhelming time. As a former chief financial officer in some large urban systems in California, I was actually in a CFO position when we went through the Great Recession. And so those were very difficult times. So I can certainly sympathize with or empathize with your positions as you kind of face this challenge head on. And so we want to start with kind of a framework that really kind of considers the work ahead. And I want to start here with this slide. It's I came across this, when you write the word crisis in Chinese, it's made up of two brush strokes. And the first one actually stands for danger, and the other one stands for opportunity. And I think it's just a very eloquent way of really thinking about how to kind of see and recognize that we're in a kind of dangerous situation, certainly from a public health perspective, but really that this is also an opportunity. As an education community, over the course of the last 4 to 7 weeks, we've really been confronted with the necessity to really radically rethink the way that we deliver instruction. And for the foreseeable future, that seems like that will continue to be the case. So though that we're in a very trying time, opportunities abound in terms of how we can take advantage of this moment. So we think it's important to really kind of lay out some guiding principles around for education systems in this emergency situation. And we think there's kind of 3 core principles here that are essential. The first is really ensuring continuity of basic services. So think about food security for your low-income students and families. And certainly the feds have leaned in to provide some of that flexibility to local communities, school districts, and schools. But it really is up to those local communities to take advantage of those opportunities, to look for partnerships locally to ensure that those basic services are in play. And this extends even further when you think about foster youth or homeless populations that struggle even more with some of the basic things beyond food, but also when it comes to shelter. Second, that we really should be focused on equitable support for those students who need it most. WestEd has been conducting some research around what were the outcomes from the Great Recession, what were the outcomes from the introduction of ARA, which at the time was basically the stimulus package that was used to basically help stem against the Great Recession. And what we're seeing is that those students, especially farthest from stable support and resources, really are the students that need even greater amounts of support, focus, and resources. So as you think about reconsidering the deployment of your existing or additionally freed up resources during a school closure, we have to be considerate of how do you think about and determine the needs of students. And that too has also begun to change. We have our kind of traditional ways, if you will, in public education of thinking about, if a student is low income or if they're an English learner or they're a student with disability. However, this moment really creates a different opportunity to really assess what are the types of supports for students that have needs that are more exacerbated as they're at home. And so one example I'll offer to you, I live in a community and I have twins, a twin boy and a girl that are in kindergarten. And one of my daughter's friends in the class is a single dad, and he works at a regional hospital as a nurse, and he's got a couple of kids in his home. But so his ability to be able to support the educational advancement of his kids is really different from my circumstance in my home. And so it's important to think about these kind of new measures and metrics that are developing around the needs of students that are being created by this situation. And one of the other things that one of the last principle that I'll kind of offer up is that despite many kind of unknowns, and there still are a lot of unknowns around this public health crisis, we can't wait to plan. And that really provides the kind of mental capacity and mental space as leaders that you are in your districts to create a chance to really think about the potential versions or options that are forthcoming, even if you don't know all of the answers at the same time. And what that creates is an ability to kind of lead in a circumstance that otherwise is, potentially unnavigable without a plan in place to think about that work ahead. So we kind of lay this out in kind of 3 phases in terms of thinking about the kind of the months and the weeks and the months ahead. And so this first kind of urgent phase really kind of is about approximately a 0 to 3 months. For those in Oklahoma and for you in your school district circumstances, you're probably about a month into this phase. And so the objective here is really to adapt the learning environment to the extent possible that also upholds orders to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, right? So this is the ultimate challenge for schools and school districts right now, is how do you ensure that you're meeting the public health guidelines that are being set out by your local and state communities, but also provide instructional opportunities for kids. And this has been a radical transformation of the way that we've always thought about delivering instruction in American public education. And so it creates this sense of urgency of how do you think about standing up these types of strategies and approaches. And so a couple of sample strategies that we want to offer to you is really around kind of engaging families and assessing their needs. One of the things that we found is that, particularly the one-to-one relationship between the teacher and the parents or the parents is really critical at this moment. Many schools are very good at, blasting out communications. The principal sends an email, everybody gets it in their inbox. But at this moment in time, really connecting with the parent to understand their circumstance, when there might be a routine to have a student engaged in learning, which is going to likely be different for every student in a classroom, is really, really important. We talked a bit about, some of the basics, continuity of service around meal delivery, mental health support, access to learning opportunities. Think, the hardware, the software, the Wi-Fi connection to get a student connected to that work. And that all of those things are basically building to get to a place in which you can set up a system that allows you to connect and have students access curriculum on some routine basis, even if it isn't, on a day-to-day basis. So the next phase, once those kind of basics are set in place, is really what we would describe as a recovery phase. So this really stretches from the late spring into the middle of the fall of this calendar year. And this recovery phase has an objective. Oh, sorry, it moved way too fast there. Apologies. So this recovery phase really, the objective here is to kind of reflect on the learnings from the urgent phase, lay the groundwork for an effective opening of school, and then initiate coordination between and among school staff and local agencies. So this really covers the period in which, as we're seeing now, a lot of states are moving to reopen. There still remains a lot of questions about what happens to the trend in the number of cases and deaths of the coronavirus, which could ultimately shift the way that public health orders will impact, the reopening of schools. But this is the opportunity to start planning now for this phase of recovery, and to think about ways in which you might initiate some sample strategies that allows you to move forward in this phase of recovery. So some of the sample strategies here, and I'm going to focus my comments on the first one, is really to think about deploying action teams for tasks that go beyond a typical opening of school. So for example, one thing that we've been learning throughout the course of this social distancing orders that have kind of stretched across the country is that many students are experiencing what you might refer to as an adverse childhood experience. It's If anybody's familiar with this, this was research that was done by the CDC and the Kaiser Foundation nearly 15 or 20 years ago. It basically hypothesizes and kind of proves this out in the research that there are a series of adverse childhood experiences that basically put children at risk for future risky behavior. Could include, things like a crime, drugs, alcohol, those kinds of things. And many of the developmental experts that helped with that work actually are identifying the coronavirus and this moment that we are having here as an adverse childhood experience. And so we really are kind of coming back into school with groups of students, types of students that really need support that goes way beyond just the academic structure of instruction and learning. That they need a chance to kind of connect with other individuals. They need a chance to connect with adults and students in a way that is going to help them get reconnected to school, get reconnected to their communities within the boundaries that public health officials are laying out for us. And so thinking about action teams that might ask questions like, how are we going to offer a diagnostic to understand where students are in our school so we can get that rapidly as students start to come back to school in the fall? Or, if you're thinking about, one of the things that we've been seeing is that it's very likely that, students will come back to school, but it's likely going to be in environments in which they have to retain 6 feet of distance from any other individual in which they're around. And that's really difficult, especially if we've built classrooms in, trillions of dollars worth of school building assets across the country. And we have 960 square foot classrooms, and we assumed a certain number of students could be in that classroom. That's no longer going to be the case. So how do we have to think about those kinds of implications and the dominoes that fall as a result of that? And so those action teams coming together to kind of think through those issues really create the opportunity to set you all up as districts and schools for success. The last phase is really around stabilization. So this really spans from the middle of the fall of 2020 through basically the spring of next year. And the objective here is really to kind of focus on learning recovery, anticipate the needs of staff and students and families, to adapt to the change in health guidelines. And this is what goes back to one of the principles that we mentioned before about having a plan and being prepared, because we really don't know what the resurgence of the coronavirus is going to look like, how it will interact with another flu season starting in the late fall and into the winter, and how that transpires, is really going to have an impact on the way that you as district leaders are going to have to respond in either being able to continue keeping school open with staggered schedules or those social guidelines in place, or you're going to have to transition back to a distance learning environment for all of your students fairly quickly. So you might imagine there's transitions that are occurring as a result of what might come forward in the fall and into the winter. And so a couple of strategies here that we wanted to offer include that kind of systematizing connections with other agencies to maximize the use of limited resources. I was mentioning before that, Felicia will talk a little bit about the CARES Act, was the federal aid package that was passed a little bit over a month ago that provides nearly $2.1 trillion in aid in a variety of different sectors. And many of those things are going to show up in local communities, not just for public education, but also for mental and behavioral support. They will show up for food subsidies for families. They're going to show up as protective gear and equipment to continue to combat the coronavirus, so on and so forth. So taking advantage of those opportunities to link up with other agencies to maximize the use of those federal resources that are forthcoming. So with that, I'll pause. I'll kind of move to monitoring the chat if you have any questions on that segment, and then I will turn it over to Felicia.
Thanks, Jason. So the next part that we're going to talk about is really determining what it is that you need as a school or as a district as you're going forward. And this is a different question than it typically is for the start of school. As Jason presented, there's a lot of new and novel situations that we're dealing with as we're going into the new school year. And this provides that opportunity to really look at what are those priority services that you as a district can provide your students. So a few notes just as we begin on prioritization. So we know we are not going to be able to do everything, and the resource landscape is going to be very different. So where do we start with that, with what to prioritize first? The first idea that we'll offer is that this is a prime opportunity to live out your school's values, really identifying what those highest values you have are as a school or district and acting on those. Do your decisions align with those values? A second idea is to prioritize the base education program, and we'll get into that in just a minute, but what are those primary services that serve as foundation? Spending your funds is always a little bit of a jittery experience, but we want to do that with the future in mind, making smart decisions about how these goals will have an impact on the improvement journey that you've already been on, and on what you hope to see in the future. So really managing between the current reality and the future reality that you're hoping for. And finally, and this is a repeat of what was said just a few moments ago, but making sure that equity is at the forefront of decision making. The most at-risk students may actually be different than that group of at-risk students that you were thinking about last year. So thinking about what does equitable support look like in this environment. With those things in mind, what we wanted to present is just a little bit of a framework on how to think about what are those baseline services that you want to make sure you're funding. One question is, what is our core mission as a district? Thinking about that as a leadership team or as a school or district leadership team will help you to set forth a set of values that you can test your decisions against. The other two things that we can't ignore are, what are our obligations to students and families? So it may not be a value that you would put in your mission statement about making sure that every student is fed, but that is an obligation that you have to students and families. And on the other side is what's required by local, state, and federal policy. We know that these are obligations that don't go away. Some of them, there are some flexibilities, which we'll talk about later in the session, but making sure that we're accounting for those three questions. What's at the core of our mission and values? What are our obligations to students and families? And what's required? From there, you can think about what are those baseline services to fulfill those obligations, that mission, and those requirements, and what are students going to need so that those services can get to every student equitably. How can we really be able to address the needs of those most at-risk students? So once you have that list of services and additional supplementary services for students who may need more, then you can finally think about what resources are available for the continuity of those services. And this is a little bit of a flip to the script that most LEAs we find take, where we're saying what money is available and what can we fund with that money. This is about putting needs first. This is about understanding what it is that you want to be able to provide, and then thinking through to finally be able to match those resources to the needs. So this is a framework to provide for your team as you're thinking about what comes next. And why this is important. One, it enables you as a district leadership team to anticipate changes in funding. So we know that funding is going to temporarily bump up in some cases and temporarily go down in other cases. And then it's going to fluctuate throughout the year. It's a very new and different financial environment for schools. And so being able to define what those baseline services are and what might be supplementary or on top of that, or sort of the nice to haves, would allow you to adjust your budget and your plan accordingly. It also sets a groundwork between team members about what expectations you have for the delivery of services. What are our foundational services that we must provide so that as a team you can get to those decisions faster. And finally, it makes sure that that framework will help make sure that those general education services get to the students that need them most. So with that framework in mind, we did want to take a moment to think about that recovery stage that Jason talked about. So you're going to get through this urgent stage, you're doing what you can. In many cases, that's Band-Aid approaches, and we get it. Now we're starting to turn our focus to recovery. What's it going to take to get us back to what we could see as a new or the now normal? And one way that we can talk about that is through the investments of the CARES Act. This is really about relief. So the CARES Act, so let's talk first about one-time versus ongoing expenses. This funding for this recovery stage, we hope, is a one-time experience. It's something that is not recurring in nature, and we need to think about expenses that are really about getting people back on track in that recovery phase. It's different from funding that you would get on an ongoing basis. And this seems like a very simple concept, but it is one to keep in the forefront as you're thinking about ways to spend the CARES Act money that might be coming your way. We want to make sure it's on one-time expenses and isn't patchworking into ongoing expenses such as teachers and staff, such as curriculum materials that are going to require upkeep or require ongoing refreshing of workbooks, or if you will, contractual services that go on. We want to think about what it is that we need right now. So keeping that frame in mind, one thing to keep at that cardinal rule for one-time funds is don't fund ongoing positions. If you know you're going to need to fund somebody's salary 2 years from now, you don't want to spend money on it that expires in 6 months. It's very difficult to retroactively put that money back. So what is the CARES Act? The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act was passed earlier in the spring by Congress to make sure that states and local agencies had the funds they need to get relief. It's not a stimulus package. It's not intended to move existing efforts forward. What it is intended to do is to provide the funding needed for these unique circumstances. It is very flexible. And we know that the federal government is thinking about ongoing responses to emerging needs. And so you may find that these funds are supplemented later on. It is the largest SEA level discretionary formula program in history. So we know that this is sort of a big deal, and we want to make sure you have the information that you need to use it wisely. Oklahoma will, so there's $30.75 billion that will be slated for elementary and that will be slated for the whole CARES Act, and $13.5 billion that will be slated for elementary and secondary education grants. Oklahoma itself will receive $161 million, which seems like a lot when you're looking at it all together, but once it gets dispersed, will not be quite as much. And Oklahoma has already applied for the funds, and should be able to get that to you very soon. So let's talk about allowable uses for these funds. Every district will get some amount, and we want them to go towards specific relief activities. There are 12 allowable uses, and I'll go through an example of each so that you can get a sense of what you might spend those on. Basically, any activity that's authorized under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, as it is newly named, would be allowed. So one example of that is academic tutoring for students. That might be virtual drop-in tutoring due to the need to work remotely. The second is about coordination with other public agencies. So we know that the Department of Human Services and child care facilities are going to be funded to provide services to students and families. We also know that it is allowable within this funding to spend money on that coordination from the LEA. So if you need to send a delegate to meet with childcare agencies to coordinate after school time care in this unique time, that's a place where you can spend this funding. The third here is resources to meet the needs of individual schools. Again, this is a really open and flexible one, but we know that specific schools are going to need specific things. And so if you have a school that's right next to a hospital and 15% of the students in that school, their caregivers are first responders, that school is going to need something a little bit different. So this is where those resources can be used to meet the individual needs of students. Number 4 is activities that address the unique needs of federally recognized student subgroups. So think students experiencing homelessness, students who are learning English, students who are designated as having special needs. All those subgroups that you normally see on your report card are, they want to be cared for, and the federal government wants to make sure that those students are cared for as well. And they may need special things in this time, such as coordinating with homeless shelters to provide extra laptops and IT support so that they can get online and get to virtual learning. Number 5 is developing systems to improve LEA response. This is things like communication structures with parents, making sure that you have task forces available to respond to specific needs. So the example here is updating text-based communication systems so that you can get information to families directly. That's a sort of one-time expense and really necessary in some of these scenarios. Training for LEA staff on sanitation. This is about making sure that your janitorial staff knows how to clean the building. It's a new need, but definitely one that's important at this time. Number 7 is purchasing cleaning supplies. We know that that's going to be a need for a lot of schools. That's a great use of these funds. Buying a year's supply of rubber gloves, if you can find them, that's a great way to spend this money. Planning for and coordinating the continuation of base services. So this is about making sure that those baseline services that we talked about earlier are continued, and what's it going to take to make sure they can continue while you're following orders for safe social distancing. So do you need to hire a short-term contractor to be the coordinator to make sure that they can go out and figure out what the needs are and fix whatever challenges come up? That could be something that you use for planning and coordination, or to pay your administrative staff to come in and for extra hours and coordinate that response for continuing services, delivery of meals, those kinds of things. Number 9 is purchasing instructional technology. This one's pretty straightforward and probably the first thing that comes to mind. We need more laptops, we need more Wi-Fi hotspots, we need to make sure that we have the software and licenses for students that can help them connect virtually. Number 10 is providing mental health services and supports. We cannot emphasize enough how much this is going to be an uptick in challenges in the need for mental health services, both for students and frankly for staff as well, making sure that they have access to those mental health services is an allowable use of funds. Number 11 is planning for summer and after school time programming to address some of those learning gaps that might be happening. The example here is you know, maybe you give a stipend to your grade level teachers to pair up with staff from the library or the zoo or a local museum, where they can provide some summer learning enrichment for students to help them get caught up. The very last activity is about continuing services and employment of existing staff. When you're looking at a shortfall in the future of your budget, this may be the first place your mind goes, is to sort of fill in those gaps. It's not, it is an allowable expense, but it's not the intention of this funding. The funding is really to make sure that students get what they need in this unique time. And there are other ways to sort of gap fill or backfill those gaps. And Jason's going to talk about those in just a minute here. So I know that was a quick review. You'll have the slides to look at, and this information is also available through your state agency. So just one more note on the CARES Act. It does provide a lot of funding for other agencies that can be coordinated. Again, those coordinating efforts with Head Start, with the Department of Human Services, with food assistance programs, they're going to get some extra money too to fill in these gaps. So coordinating with them to make sure that there's a continuity of services and you're really holistically and efficiently meeting students' needs may be something that you want to prioritize when you're thinking about how to spend time and money. Oh, sorry, one more slide. So recommendations, just a review. These are one-time funds. They're only going to be available for a short time. And so using them for the specific needs of the moment is really the priority here. You want to invest in quality program delivery during these school closures and into the fall, where we're not sure how that's going to play out, how the opening of school will play out. I'm going to make sure that you're refining your approach to distance learning and making sure that you're closing gaps and providing for students' mental and physical needs. And then finally, again, avoid using these funds for these ongoing investments, really thinking about them as one-time short-term investments. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Jason, who's going to talk a little bit about flexibilities for those ongoing investments. Once you get into the stabilization phase, how do you think about resources, particularly federal resources, to move forward?
Great, thanks so much, Felicia. So as Felicia had mentioned, part of this section is really thinking about those federal resources. So again, just a reminder around some of our guiding principles here that we think are really important to kind of keep in mind. We've talked a bit about continuity of basic services, focusing on those students that have the most need, and really not waiting to plan, but putting something in place, even if it has a couple of options or versions of how you might go about this. So the key concepts in this section is really kind of 5 in total, the way that we think about the use of federal funds. So we'll talk a bit about redeployment of staff, intent and allowability, basics of federal fiscal flexibility, some comments about supplement versus supplant with some of the exceptions, and then the national emergency waivers, which are extending significantly more flexibility to states and to localities across a whole broad range of federal education laws. So let's start with redeployment of staff. And this is a great moment to really think about how to redeploy skilled staff by really mapping their availability and skill sets to the needs of students during the outbreak. So in a distance learning environment in particular, in a physical location, you may have been constrained by the way in which an adult was working with a student or a group of students. Or you may have staff, such as an attendance clerk or other types of classified staff, that don't have the same routines that they might have otherwise had if they were at the school, with students in a normal or typical environment. And so this creates the opportunity to really rethink the way that you're deploying staff to support students. We've got a couple of examples here about how that might happen, but in your circumstance, that could also look really different. So one example of this is thinking about a literacy coach that's creating lesson plans for small group interventions. So they're helping to support a teacher as they're doing small groups throughout the course of the day. If in an asynchronous environment, there is students that are doing their independent work on their kind of virtual learning environment. You might think about leveraging the assistant principal to lead family engagement efforts, especially when it comes to families that have been really difficult to get a hold of. The assistant principal might coordinate an effort to reach out to different resources, agencies, friends and family of those parents to start to as I was mentioning before, kind of build up that one-on-one connection between the parent and between the school itself. We've got a couple of other examples here as well, but really thinking about reorienting staff's time around the need of students. This is an extraordinary opportunity to really reorient resources that directly are meeting the needs of some of your highest need students in your school and school district environments, and a great opportunity to think about how you might use those staff to meet those needs. So the next one here is around intent and allowability. So intent meaning, what is the intention of that federal pot of money, if it's Title I, II, III, IV, or any other title program for that matter? And then what is the allowable use? And I think it's important to remember here that what's really different about federal law, the Every Student Succeeds Act today, than what it was under the No Child Left Behind, its predecessor, essentially, is that the intent and allowability has really kind of flopped, right? Before, the allowable use was really what was driving the use of those title funds. And what the federal government saw as a chance to really create flexibility for states and for local school districts, and I think this was really wise on their part, is to get school districts and schools to think first around, what do you intend to do in helping students within the boundaries of these title programs? So as an example, if you are wanting to use Title III funds to, for example, support English learners, that is a broader definition than saying, oh, you can only spend Title III dollars on professional development, parent, family, and community engagement activities, or materials that are specifically geared for English learners. That the intent kind of creates the frame to say, if there's an ability to understand and justify the use of those resources to support English learners, that there's flexibility in allowing those funds to be used in that regard. So we just offer this as a guidepost for 4 of the major title programs within ESSA that talk about both intent, first and foremost, but also as allowability. The next one here is really around the basics of federal fiscal flexibility. So from the authorization of ESSA, the U.S. Department of Ed has issued several points of guidance. There was a series of them that came out in 2016. There was another series of them that came out in 2018. And this moment in responding to this, to the coronavirus pandemic, has created another opportunity where the federal government, specifically the U.S. Department of Ed, has really advanced some knowledge about what federal flexibilities exist. And so here are 3 of the major provisions that currently exist today. I'll talk about some of these exceptions. The first one is on transferability, and what it allows is for movement of resources among most of the title programs. In fact, the U.S. Department of Education just, I think I believe it was on Friday, reissued guidance around transferability. They make the caveat that the state's consolidated state plan will identify which title programs you can move dollars to and from in terms of allowability. But what they also note in that guidance, and we're happy to provide this to the State Department to pass along to you all in your districts, is that if there is another title program or another federal education program in which the state would like to seek flexibility, they can submit that to the U.S. Department of Ed, and within 30 days, more likely within a week, get a response in terms of that allowance for transferability. So just another example of the U.S. Department of Ed, I think, really going out of its way to offer up those flexibility and transferability opportunities. The second around consolidation is that it really collapses resources to support the administration of programs aligned to the design of the intervention. As school districts and schools that have completed a comprehensive needs assessment, if there's anything in that CNA that identifies a need of the school, it basically creates some allowability to use consolidated funds for that purpose. And that also kind of flows to the discretion for school and district improvement as well, that the federal law offers a lot of latitude to administrators for how and where to direct resources to improve outcomes. So that's that CNA coverage, that if you've identified it in the needs assessment, if it's something that is critical to advancing achievement, student achievement in your environment, that the law, especially on federal flexibility, allows for the use of funds from those different title programs to be used for those purposes in a fashion that really is geared first around the need of the student and the strategy, and not necessarily around the strict allowable use of the fund itself. The next provision here that we think is important to talk about is supplement, not supplant. It remains a kind of cardinal, kind of foundational principle of federal dollars, and I think wisely speaks to this notion that, one, that the federal government wants to be able to incentivize state and local governments to continually invest in K-12 education. The federal government never intended that they would send dollars to a community and that a community could then pull back its investment on public education. But we recognize as a country, as a union, that it's really important to make these investments, and those investments make a difference in terms of the outcomes of students. And so on that principle, supplement versus supplant still does exist. We still have to kind of track time around the use of those federal funds, but the restrictions upon which they are built in terms of coding every single expenditure to its allowable use is a lot of those restrictions have been loosened quite a bit in comparison to what we've seen in the past under NCLB. I think notable on this slide is really the exceptions, and I think that the one that is likely to come up for a lot of states over the course of the next several months and perhaps several years is really that second bullet, that an LEA may overcome the second presumption of supplanting if it can demonstrate with evidence that the program or activity will be eliminated due to state or local funding reductions. And unfortunately, as the economic and financial circumstances as a result of the pandemic have started to unfold, a lot of what we are seeing is that states and localities are very likely going to see contractions, quite significant contractions in their revenue, which may create an opportunity for the LEA to reconsider how it's using both its federal dollars in comparison to a smaller amount of state or local dollars as well. So the last provision I want to talk about here is the National Emergency Educational Waivers. It offers a tremendous amount of flexibility to LEAs for next year. Right now, all of this flexibility falls under the CARES Act, which is in effect until June 30th of 2021. So effectively, the remainder of this school year into the summer, and then through the 2020-21 school year. And so here is just some highlights on some of the temporary waivers that have been authorized by the U.S. Department of Ed. As a procedural matter, the U.S. Department of Ed did extend to each one of the states, in your case in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma State Department of Education, the opportunity to apply for a waiver that says we would want flexibility provisions in these set of programs. And our understanding is that the Department of Ed has been extraordinarily responsive in that regard. They released this guidance along with the application for the waiver. I believe it was 2 or 2.5 weeks ago. And as SEAs have submitted, state agencies have submitted their applications to the U.S. Department of Ed, turnaround has been less than 72 hours. And I believe Oklahoma has submitted that, so they have some of these flexibilities that are already in place as a result. So let's go over a couple of those. So first and foremost, that the U.S. Department of Ed has authorized a temporary waiver from many of the restrictions in ESSA that include, in Title I, there's a school-wide program eligibility poverty threshold. That threshold is no longer as high as what it was, and so the ability to use dollars in a school-wide program manner as opposed to directed at certain specific types of programs, has now been loosened. So again, being able to allow federal funds to be used in a much more kind of flexible nature is something that that is in play. I think the one thing to remember is that, or this next one is really around maintenance of effort requirements. So what the CARES Act says is that it recognizes that in exchange for taking funds from this emergency federal authorization, that the state will maintain its level of effort and requirements. Now, there's an exception to that in which the state can submit to the federal government a waiver and say, hey, there's no way we're going to be able to meet this requirement, and basically provide justification. And there may be many states, potentially including Oklahoma, that may have to submit those types of waivers depending on the level of severity of the kind of economic and fiscal distress that might be felt in the coming fiscal year. There also is a waiver on the 15% cap on carryover of funds, federal funds, and the obligation period of those federal funds. Many states, had gotten their school improvement dollars significantly late in the FY18 year. And I think many were nervous about having to spend those funds out over the course of the next 3 or 4 months in the midst of this emergency. And the federal government basically allowed for the carryover of those funds as an exception, effectively creating another 16 months for the use of those dollars that, again, in our opinion, we think is a great opportunity for localities in the state to really take a little bit of a step back and say, what is the best use of these funds in coordination with an environment that might have more limited state and local funds as well. Fourth, that the requirements requirements around conducting a needs assessment for especially Title IV funds has all but been lifted. So the Title IV funds don't necessarily require that needs assessment to be in place. A little bit more on Title IV there in terms of restrictions on percentages to be spent on particular types of activities. Those have been loosened as well. So the buckets of what needs to be spent no longer are in play. And then the definition of professional development activities has been expanded quite a bit, really to address what is obviously inevitably an environment in which many teachers and principals and other district-based staff are going to need a lot of support in thinking about what does the professional development environment going to look like, especially as we move to a situation where distance learning might become a more permanent fixture in the way that we deliver instruction in the future. So I'll pause there. I want to turn it back over to Felicia, and we'll go from there. Or sorry, Corey. That's right. Sorry, Corey. My apologies.
No worries. Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm Corey, also working with Jason and Felicia at WestEd. So as you're thinking about using your resources, be it existing or anticipated financial resources, your staff time, or even your own time and attention, we developed this rapid response planning tool with the Oklahoma Department of Ed to help you think through what kind of questions you might want to be trying to answer and how to go about planning in the near term. So if you, excuse me, sorry. So the purpose of the tool is for school and district leaders to try and assess and respond to current needs during the urgent stage. If you recall earlier, as Jason shared, there's the urgent, recovery, stabilization. As you're thinking about this urgent stage, this tool is trying to help you think through your priorities, any progress points or potential challenges, the needs and opportunities across those a given set of areas of concern, what actions you might need to take to immediately respond to those, and then beginning to help you think about how to monitor progress towards reaching those goals. The tool itself is going to be shared with you by the school support specialists. So they're going to reach out to you to help you think through how to use this tool and guide you through answering some of the questions in it. You can see a bit.ly there in which you can take a look at it, and I'll chat it right now if you want to take a look and make a copy and go through it. But the tool itself, just to kind of briefly review, it has 4 main sections. The first is allows you to reflect on your current state, how you've been spending your time and attention, where you've been able to make progress and what is of most concern for you right now. With that then feeding into this review of any kind of immediate needs. So across a number of given areas of concern that we've listed out, things like teaching and learning, student supports, staffing, we're asking you to think through what actions you've taken to address that area in the last few weeks, what still needs to be done to solve any particular concerns in that area, and then what supports or resources you need in order to address concerns in that area. That then is meant to help you begin to think through all the kind of suite of things that might be areas of concern right now in order to focus in on one or two areas that might be most concerning. From there, the tool guides you through a rapid response plan in which it asks you to envision what your system might look like 4 to 8 weeks from now, and what's a short-term rapid response SMART goal. So something accomplishable within the next 4 to 8 weeks. And then what are the actions needed in order to reach that? That also includes potential expense planning, depending on the particular goal, as well as asking you to begin to think through how you might monitor progress on that plan. Lastly, and then we'll turn to Q&A, the tool has a fourth section in which it offers an opportunity for you to track how you're responding and how you're making progress towards your goal, in which there are up to 4 checkpoints that we'd recommend you think of addressing every 7 to 10 days, asking questions like, well, what have you done? What progress have you made towards your goal? What additional challenges are existing towards that goal? So again, this tool, I've put a link in the chat for you to take a look at it, but the school support specialists are going to be reaching out to you to help talk with you about how you might use this tool for your particular setting. All right, so we're going to open it up to Q&A. I know we only have a few minutes until 11, but what questions do you all have about everything we've presented today?
And feel free to share those questions in the chat, or if you can, feel free to unmute yourself as well. We have a question in the chat. Will we see some flexibilities with our 2021 515 funds? I am going to shoot that one over to Brooke, who might be able to.
Absolutely. Yes, and we've already begun to put some of those flexibilities in place with the funds that you have now. Those will carry over, and we'll continue to be as flexible as we possibly can. We don't have as much flexibility as the CARES funds, but we can get pretty close. And so many of you have already been working with us on how to readjust your budgets to change your original budget to be more responsive to what you're doing right now. So absolutely, we will continue our flexibilities as long as we feel like we're in this recovery and stabilization period.
Thank you for that question.
I'm going to be, this is Brooke again. I'm going to be cognizant of our time and make sure that we can get everybody to their next probably Zoom meeting that they have waiting. I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you Felicia and Jason and Corey for helping us with this work and delivering today. And as Corey said, your school support specialist will reach out to you. You can certainly reach out to them, and our Office of School Support is available to you at any time. We hope you all stay safe and stay well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.